What's going on, guys? It's Bromley, and today we are going to deconstruct the deadlift. Now, this is something that I have done quite a bit before. I have a lot of videos on deadlift mechanics and setup and programming approaches and why some people struggle and it's a huge pain in the ass and why others seem to just go off and hit endless PRs despite training like gorillas. So the things we're going to cover, we're going to go over deadlift leverages. We're going to go over how that affects your setup. We're going to go over how that should affect your training. It might impact recovery. It might impact what accessory exercises you can work with or which ones are going to be best suited for you. And we're going to give some examples of how mechanics change from lifter to lifter and why they might pull the way that they do. We got to cover a few basic principles to really get a handle on how the demands of deadlifting changes from lifter to lifter. When you talk about a pivot point and a lever, the further a load is across that lever away from the pivot point, the more work has to be done in order to move the same load the same distance. So imagine a fishing pole. For each increment of distance that you increase that pole by, it takes a smaller and smaller fish to put the same amount of stress on the fisherman. If you have a load that is farther in front of you, it is harder to move and it is harder to support. So if you consider that the back, the spine, is a rod like that, it's like the fishing pole, then you understand that the longer the spine is, the more work those muscles around the spine have to do. Also, it takes a lot more work from the glutes and the hamstrings in order to move, in order to lever that spine up. Now, most of you know that I've been doing strongman since 2006. It's about 15 years now. I just got into America's Strongest Man, which is historically a pro-only show. They decided to open up an online qualifier, one event of which was a 725 deadlift for reps. I pulled it for 5. Well, it was 1 deadlift and 4 bounces, but it was allowed, so it flies. And guys, don't be that person that does a bounce set of deadlifts and plugs it into a rep max calculator and treat it like that's actually what you're capable of pulling. It is not the same. It's just like your biggest working set of squats isn't going to tell you what your best bottom-up squat is. So if I can do 1 rep, I can bounce through 3 more on just about anything. But if I'm being honest, I had maybe 30 more pounds in me that day. Now, in the last 15 years, I've overcome a lot of injuries. I had a decade of chronic low back injuries because I wasn't paying attention to my leverages and to the limiting factor that prevented me from progressing without getting injured. And it wasn't until I figured that out and started making strides that I was able to stay healthy and actually hit the gas on my deadlift. And that ended a 10-year-long purgatory of no deadlift progress. So 6 weeks ago, I submit the video. My pull is at an all-time high. I'm eager to come in just topped out and kill it at ASM and finally have a competitive pull at the highest level, and everything's just going to be fantastic. And my wife's going to get that promotion, and then I'm going to get famous, and then my dogs are going to start crapping in the toilet, and all of those dreams are slowly crashing to the ground because this prep is absolutely botched. Now, what had happened earlier in this year, as happens very often when I have a long stretch in between contests, is I tend to get a little soft. I have a sweet tooth. I like calories. Calories make lifting easier. The logical conclusion is to eat a pie from Sprouts every night. So earlier this year, I committed to a very intensive deadlift protocol, which I actually plan on putting up at some point, that was pulling twice every 9 days. I was alternating a volume day with an intensity day, and it just worked so stupidly well. Like words can't even explain. It worked better than I thought it could. But the key ingredient in hindsight was the insane amount of calories I was taking down. I was never hungry. I was always on a full bloat. I was taking a ton of protein. I was doing chicken shakes on a daily basis. And it was the longest run of probably the highest protein and carbohydrate intake I'd taken in a very, very long time. And the result was my deadlift exploded. It culminated with pillars of strength. And somehow in that miserable Texas heat, I pulled a 755 axle deadlift from 13 inches. Now the thing is, I am competitive, not in the heavyweights, but in the 231s, the 105 kilo division. And that brings an extra element of weight manipulation that I ignore very often. I should be staying lean, but I take pride in the fact that I'm the world's fattest middleweight. And the farther I am away from a competition, the farther I get away from 105, up to 115, 120, 125. Yes, I was 275 pounds when I pulled that axle deadlift. And that was 2 months before I need to be 231 on a scale. So I am very comfortable dropping weight. I immediately got into a calorie deficit. I started doing cardio. And within 4 or 5 weeks, I noticed a pretty steady decline in my static strength. Now, the funny thing is, My movement's better. I have more endurance. So a lot of the events, I'm actually better than I was a couple months ago. But on the ones that count, the static power movements, the ones that test absolute strength, I'm substantially lower than I was, and that's not the way that this was supposed to go. So, thing one I should have fixed is I should have been a lot more measured with my diet. I should not have been losing weight so aggressively. I should have kept my protein intake much higher than it was. When I lose weight, my erectors and my abdominals and my lats can't brace me as well, and that's my problem area, is keeping my torso rigid. And I feel each pull more, and I get anxious or nervous that I'm going to injure myself. Or even if I don't get injured, my back will be stiff longer, and it prevents me from doing other things. So I tried to get around it by incorporating a technique I had used to prep for the max deadlift last year for nationals. That actually took me to my biggest pull at the time, which was a 718. And I was practicing a powerlifting setup, a reactive dive bomb pull. I would take my breath at the top, sink one hand in, pull myself in, and by that point, I was very tight, and I would commit to explosively pushing through the floor, and it got me over my fear of pulling. It made it so I couldn't hesitate. I actually got very good with that, especially on a deadlift bar where I could use the whip to my advantage. That stopped working this time around, or at least didn't work as well as I thought it would, for a couple of reasons. The thing I noticed right off the bat was that my erectors were absolutely smoked, and that's going to be, again, related to some of these leverage issues. My erectors were toast. I would get to about 80% and feel the fatigue from my neck all the way down to my tailbone, like the way your bicep feels after a really hard set of curls. And it made it so that the heaviest attempts that I'm used to being fresh for actually wasn't fresh, and I wasn't able to pull as aggressively. And that was a big damn problem. Now, the technique of that reactive approach, as I would come down into the bar, is I would have to push hard and come back. But as I would come down, I would end up tipping over the bar a little bit more than normal. I would really try to let my arms hang. I would get a little bit more of a round in my upper back. But I was good enough at getting tight that I could commit, even with my longer torso and my prior bracing issues. It seemed to work. But I was noticing very quickly that with the calorie deficit, not getting those calories in, and with trying this new approach that I hadn't really trained all this year, that it was just taking too much out of me. So my training led to frustration, which led to this and this. God damn it. Essentially me throwing tantrums, taking my ball, and going home. So I started to think deeply, okay, what worked for me before? Well, my first 700-pound pull was not in that style. It was actually with straps. And I did set up at the bottom, and I did feel very strong, and I wasn't that heavy. I wasn't as saturated with calories as I was during this run-up. What I was doing at the time was focusing on getting my weight back behind the bar to try and nullify the effect that my long torso has on my pull. So the idea was that by keeping my shins vertical and putting the bar all the way up against, right up against my shin and dragging the whole way, that my hips could stay back, which made it easier to brace, which fixed a big weakness for me, or it made it easier to work around that weakness. And that is what I had let go over the last year. But all of this got me thinking about how all of this is connected: leverages, strong and weak muscles, setup, recovery, and how you have to logically think through your training if you want to be able to continuously progress. Hey guys, if you found any of this helpful, please consider subscribing, hitting the like button, leaving a comment. I try to get back to all comments as soon as possible. Everybody's support on this channel is what allows me to put out content and do all of this in the first place. So I appreciate everybody's support. Go ahead and check out Peak Strength and Base Strength for more insight into how I approach programming and how I dissect lifts just like this. That's available on Amazon or at EmpireBarbellStore.com. Go ahead and pick up some Empire Barbell merch while you're at it. Now, it's also important to know, and this is intuitive, most of you know this already, that the closer you are to lockout, the stronger the position you're in. If you imagine a scissor jack, you could have the end of your car up on that, and if it's that close to being vertical, all you got to do is tap that joint, and it'll snap right into lockout. Over here, you see how far away that joint is, that pivot point is from the center of mass, which means a lot more work has to be done. Closer to lockout, mechanically you're stronger. Also, the muscles are more fully contracted. There's a definable range of where muscles are stronger and weaker, but generally, the more stretched a muscle is, the weaker it is. The more contracted a muscle is, the stronger it is. So it works both ways. So if we evaluate the different types of lifters, now in this example, I really just fixed the height to leg ratio. We're assuming that arm length is the same, that height is the same. So this example, this guy is pretty long limbed. You can see those are pretty long arms. He's all leg, pretty long femur. So what does that mean? That means his knee joint's gonna start a little bit more open. It means that his hip is gonna be a little bit higher. And some of you might know people that pull like this. If you do have a relatively short torso and long legs, generally you're going to be pitched over a lot more because you have to in order to get to the bar. Now, even though that might seem a little disadvantaged in the hip joint, we have to understand the knee joint is starting very open, so you get very strong leg drive right out the gate. And the short torso is actually a bit easier to stabilize. A shorter torso can just brace and support a ton of load. And every hard effort isn't going to take quite as much out of somebody with a short torso when it comes to those muscles working. Now, if we keep everything the same and just shorten this guy's legs and lengthen his torso a little bit, so now the limb ratio is switched, you find that they have to squat down a little bit lower. In order to get to the bar, the butt has to drop down, so you're looking at a closer knee angle and you're looking at a closer hip angle, and this person's a little more upright. Now there's a little bit of a trade-off here. Guys with shorter femurs tend to be predisposed to squatting a little bit more, so it's likely you see people who enjoy squatting because mechanically it's easy and they can recover, so they like to squat and they get very strong legs. And these are the same people you see put a ton of leg drive into their deads. They use those powerful thighs to push into the ground to get it started. But this upright position can be a little bit more awkward. Now, I just wanted to fix that height-leg ratio here, but we tend to see shorter limbs in the same person. It's rare that you get long arms, short legs, or vice versa. So right here, if this lifter actually had shorter arms, what would that do? It would mean not only is he squatted down more, but he would have to bend over into a deeper squat. He's limited on how upright he could be the entire way because some of the weight has to be over the bar. You can't be completely behind the bar or you'll fall over. So there's a point where squatting to a certain degree to stay upright isn't an option. So you get this longer torsoed lifter who has to get over the bar and who has to brace that midsection and keep that upper back tight. Well, every time this lifter pulls, you're looking at more range of motion, you're looking at a more awkward start that requires a bigger surge of effort right at the beginning. And you're looking at each rep comparatively, each bit of effort comparatively taking more out of him and building a bigger recovery deficit. Not only does this lifter squat lower at the start, but they're going to lock out closer to their actual hips, where this type of lifter might just barely clear his kneecaps. That's one of the easiest things to spot when you're trying to evaluate whether somebody's advantaged or not in a lift. At the start of a deadlift, you're going to see an open knee and an open hip, and at the lockout, you're going to see that bar just getting over the kneecap. Oftentimes, there's plenty of lifters that just lock out on their kneecaps. That's probably the best sign that they're advantaged. Now, those of you in this advantage camp probably find that you can pull more aggressively and your deadlift outpaces your squat and maybe your bench press. There are a lot of guys who get to the 6s into the 7s with this type of build and they might have a 500 or a 550 squat. And that's not uncommon for those types of builds. Now, part of it is that the long femur makes squatting a little more awkward. So it's not necessarily that they can't get their squat as good. A lot of it has to do with that technical barrier. Now, similarly for these guys, and I put myself in this camp, the shorter limb, longer torso lifters are going to find that they squat very easily. It becomes their favorite lift. They can recover. They can see growth, so that's what they stick to. And oh my God, it's deadlift day. I hate it. I don't want to go through this. I'm just going to screw my recovery for the week and spend all day feeling bad about myself. Remember that neither of these builds are a death sentence for any one lift. There is always a way to become a technician. There's always a way to isolate your weaknesses. You just have to see it from this perspective so you can make better decisions. Longer femur, you're going to squat with a wider stance, you're going to tip over a little bit, and that's fine. You set your standard, you get comfortable at the bottom, and you make sure that you don't take shortcuts just because it feels better. You have to learn to enjoy the suck. Similarly, with these deadlift leverages, I had to learn to enjoy the suck of deadlifting. I have to learn how to grind. Grinding feels horrible in a deadlift. From the second I pull, all the pressure's in my face, I'm straining through my midsection and my upper back, and that is what feels like is going. I can't tell you the last time I actually got sore through my glutes or hamstrings from a deadlift workout. It's always in these muscles. It's always me squeezing, trying to get tighter and more efficient. Now, the work that I've done to build myself out to increase my deadlift over the last few years was actually to focus on this musculature because that's where I was disadvantaged. It didn't matter how strong my glutes and hamstrings got. If I couldn't brace my midsection, it didn't matter. I would give. Each rep would take more out of me because that's a big hit to your nervous system. When those erectors end up getting stretched open as the load gets too heavy, you can't do that a lot in one workout. It's tantamount to a heavy negative. You cannot recover from that type of give where you're just hanging on your erectors and all these big muscles in your torso are being stretched open. So you have to find a way to lock in and stay locked in. Now, these guys typically don't have to worry about that. They are solely going to be concerned with building up their motor, building up the movers. The stronger you get your glutes, the stronger you get your hamstrings, the better off you're going to be, because that is pretty much where the entire pull happens. So let's show this example with a couple of guys. The first two guys I'm going to show are pretty similar in builds. They're both lanky, long limbs. I'm going to show Arthur French, who has, I believe, a high 700 pull. And he's another guy whose pull leads his deadlift by 100, 150 pounds or so. And Kaylor Woolham, who everybody knows, is one of the best deadlifters of all time. Notice that at the start, head is up, very, very upright position. His build gives kind of the best of all worlds. His knees are forward at the start, so he gets his quads engaged to get good push through the ground. His hips are back. When some people, myself as an example, have that forward knee angle, like when I do that dive bomb approach, my weight ends up over the bar, puts a ton of strain on my upper back, my erectors, my midsection. Notice that his weight is back, his hips are pretty high, and he's upright. Those are a lot of things that generally don't go together in a deadlift setup. As he comes up in a position, he gets the bar to his knees and he's almost completely locked out. All he has to do is scoop his hips forward. Remember the scissor jack, just hips got to tap forward and that bar gets just those last couple inches over the kneecap. And when he's standing erect, that's when it's the most pronounced. I think his biggest advantage, more so than leg or torso length, is his reach. I think this man has very long arms relative to his build and it suits him. Now going into Woolham, he's built very similarly and his start is going to be pretty similar. Notice that at the start, knees are forward, heads up. He's a little upright, but he's not quite as upright as Arthur was. I think Kaylor has a shorter, stockier torso relative to Arthur, but he gets the benefit of that rigidness. It doesn't fold, it doesn't cave as easily. It's easier to stay rigid under these immense loads as he pushes just violently with his legs and hips. But he still has a forward knee angle. He still has the hips high and back. As he pulls, he just ends up a little more pitched over, a little more over the bar. But similarly, that lockout is just so easy. It's easily the bottom third of his thighs that he locks out on. He just has to shove his hips in, and that bar snaps very efficiently. Again, very long arms relative to his height. That's his superpower here. Kaylor, I think, just has a bit longer femur than Arthur does. Now, Cohen, this is how you get a 902 deadlift at 220. Cohen has some similar features here. He's just short. So he's like the stockier version of the long-limbed lifter. And it's not quite as obvious until you catch him at just the right point of his lift. So here we have an example of Cohen pulling conventional in competition. But you see one of the best squatters ever really load into his hips to get that huge push, to get that violent drive through, to get momentum on the bar to start. And then once he takes that bar into his hands, once he gets that momentum, you see him ride into his strongest position, which is hips back, knees a little more stiff. And that's really where you see how compressed his torso is, which makes yanking into big weights just much, much less devastating. So that's absolutely an advantage to him. And then you see as he locks out again, gets it to his knees, and the hips just gotta rock through. Just barely gotta come in, and then he snaps right into lockout. So now we're gonna go into some guys who aren't as obviously advantaged, don't have these obviously pronounced limb proportions. They might have some, but it's a little less blatant. Not everybody is going to be on this extreme. It's not just long leg, short leg. That's not how this works. Everybody's going to have some different conformation of arm to limb to torso ratio. And there's other things we can see. Some people get into a setup just because it's comfortable. Kokolaev is a good example. He was an Olympic lifter, champion Olympic lifter for a lot of years. 2005, I think he was a Russian weightlifting champion. Had something like a 550 clean and jerk. Very accomplished. Kokolaev, you look at him at the top standing up, he's not obviously one-sided. He looks pretty proportionate, actually. His reach to his legs, to his torso, I mean, everything looks pretty proportionate here. He's not obviously a one-sided puller. And he's, I think, deadlift and squatted over 900 pounds. Extremely strong guy, world's strongest man finalist, very well-rounded athlete. As he sets up, this has nothing to do with optimizing a deadlift. He was an Olympic lifter. You get good at how you train. Thousands and thousands of crisp reps, starting a clean in a full squat, then taking the weight on the way up. This is where he's confident. This is where he's aggressive. This is what he dialed in and what he was able to apply to his pull. So you see he squats way down. You might look at this and be like, oh, that guy must have very long legs. Look how low he's squatting. Look how far back and down his hips are. But really, that's the mobility he trained for. That's years of practice. And then as he comes up, he takes the weight with him. He ends up a little more pitch forward. So now we see this is more of a traditional start for a deadlift. And you see how strong his upper back and glutes are. You can't pull your hips through until the bar is over the knees. So when you see somebody who gets more erect as they get through the lift, but before the bar is over their knees, that takes a ton of upper back strength, a ton of strength through the posterior chain. It's just a testament to how strong this man was. Then we go into someone like Pete Rubish, who I think Pete mainly just has longer arms relative to his height. I don't know how long his femurs are. He looks like it looks like they're both long, honestly, which means they're proportionate. But you see he starts with a very open knee in this kind of rack pull position. Knees are open. He gets a ton of leg drive in his strongest possible point, but he's upright. He's very upright at the start. So he's got kind of an open hip, kind of an open knee. Everything's distributed evenly. And he's very upright, which means he can brace his torso better. And it's not an awkward position. For many of us, getting upright at the start of a deadlift is extremely awkward and it's not really viable. For him, it's a strong position and he gets to make the most out of it. So he pushes through, that bar gets to his knees, and then again, look, he locks out about halfway above his thigh. So it's not like he is the most advantaged deadlifter ever. He has a very strong starting position, and that works to his advantage. I think he has a little bit of a longer torso, lets his shoulders hang considerably. He's got that build. It reminds me of the Elite from Halo, where his shoulders are like half a foot below his neck, where the traps slant down like that. And he gets a really long hang. This guy's neck is like 2 feet long. And to build off Rubish, if you're talking about somebody who has to build immensely strong upper back and midsection to be able to have a hang, there really isn't a better example than Konstantinov. But this is a guy, again, kind of proportionate. He's not obviously lopsided one way or the other as a deadlifter in terms of his build. Really takes advantage of the hang, lets his shoulders hang way down, gets a pretty pronounced round in his thoracic spine, which is perfectly fine. That is not something that will lead to injury. Your upper back is very strong. It just has to be glued into that position. You don't want it to go as you pull. You want to start there, want to be glued in. Looks down at the ground to really pronounce that hump. But you see he's in a pretty low squat at the start. Hips are back way down. Lower back is completely neutral. That's big. The round doesn't come until his upper back. So by getting his arms to hang long, he's got longer straps now. So he's starting in a more advantaged spot. He doesn't have to pull the bar as far. He's starting in that closer to that rack pull position by having a longer reach. But also, wherever the load is in the hips, remember, it's leverage. The closer the load is to the hips, the better. So if you have some round in your back and it's not devastating to your posture, that's technically better leverages. Now we want to find a spot where the spine is rigid and supported and secure. So it's not going to be a complete round. But just by letting the shoulders down, getting that hump, he can close that gap by a couple of inches. And that might be the difference between a make or a miss at 900 pounds. So now we're going to get into the guys that are a little stumpier, longer torso. This is going to be kind of the theme. Guys that have more length in their body than they might have through their legs, and how that changes their dynamics. So we just saw the guys that can start with those open knee and hip angles in that rack pull position. So we're going to start with George Lehman. George Lehman was a nasty deadlifter. I don't know if he's still lifting or if he's still competing, but so many years back, he had some huge feats of strength. And what stood out about George is that he doesn't have a typical deadlift build. He has pretty long arms, and that's always an advantage. But if you notice at the start, as he sets in, as he takes tension out of the bar, his butt comes way down and he gets very upright. Also notice he doesn't have the forward knee angle that French had, that Woolam had. He has a little more of a vertical shin, hips are back and down, and he's pretty upright. Now you still see he's got the big hang, he's letting his shoulders round forward, trying to get as much distance as he can. But at the start, the pull is very much a squat, and he stays upright throughout the entire pull, which is a very awkward position for many people to try and execute it. But he's able to keep his hips back, which takes that stress off of his torso and allows him to drive through the ground. And then at the right moment, as that bar gets to his knees, he's able to glide his hips through and pull his shoulders back to the top. This is a very unique build because you usually don't see long arms and short legs together. It happens occasionally, it's a little more rare. If you see George get through a working set, you see how violent and aggressive he is through all of these reps. I mean, this is 800 pounds, and I think it's the touch and go reps, but he clears through something like 8 reps, which is pretty inhuman. This is an example of where mass can make up for a disadvantage. I would say the long torso on someone like George is a little bit more of a disadvantage than somebody who has a shorter torso at the same height. But George is huge. He's big. He's got a lot of mass on his shoulders and arms, on his upper back, throughout his midsection. I mean, the guy is like insulated, and that's what mass does. You can use it. You can apply it to specific areas to reinforce where you might be weak. So if you have something that is perceived as a disadvantage, spend the time to do the work to round it out, and that will make all the difference in the world. You can always reinforce these weak areas by focusing your training on them, and he's a perfect example of doing so. Now from there, we go to one of the best squatters of all time. 5-6 years ago, Lillibridge and Melandichev were going back and forth for the squat record, and they were both in the 1,050, knocking on 1,100 pounds territory. Now the thing is, Melandichev was a good sumo puller. Eric was a strong conventional puller, which is not quite as common for the biggest squatters in the world. Now, he has a little bit of a long torso, shorter legs, makes him predisposed to being a good squatter. He's very efficient, can stay upright, hips drop into the hole pretty easily. Eric uses this kind of pump style to build up tension, take that tension out of the bar, feel your body, take that weight. And at the last moment, right before he pulls, you see that he's essentially leg pressing through the floor. You see how upright he is? Again, just like the illustration earlier, the shorter legs with the longer torso favors more upright position. And he uses those strong legs to get the bar moving. Now his shin angle, again with the slightly shorter legs, not quite as forward as we saw again with Arthur and with Kaler. But Eric's big task here was to be able to develop the upper back and midsection strength to support that longer torso so that he can express all the power of his legs and hips onto that bar. And he did that very well. This is a 900-pound pull he hit quite a few years ago. And you see a bar, it's midway up, if not slightly above the midway point on his thigh. Not the best pulling mechanics in the world, but he was able to do one of the biggest, a conventional powerlifting setup with a 900-pound deadlift, very, very few people are capable of. That was a world-class feat. And he was able to do that with what I would argue are not the best leverages in the world. And that just goes to show how much room you have to intelligently pick apart your training to work around what you might see as leverage deficiencies. Another guy I really like is Kirill Sarachev because everybody knows him as a freak bencher, but he was actually all around a nasty lifter. He was, I think, a 23 and some change total, 2,300 pound and some change total. Very strong all the way around. Again, similar to Lillibridge, you can see standing upright that a lot of his height's in his torso. He has shorter legs relative to his height. And you see how easily he sinks into the hole in a squat. Very comfortable, very upright. Knees go forward just a bit, and his butt's already in the hole. You see this guy is built for these types of lifts. But watch how just absolutely strong Sarachev is on a deadlift. You see, he's the example I was talking about, a shorter limb lifter. If you also make the arms a little shorter, he has to bend way over. His shoulders are over the bar. His butt is back and down, and he's bent forward. Not what you would call an advantage position, but again, this is what happens when you apply intensity. You can tell he likes to deadlift. When you apply that extra mass, that extra strength and power, this is what you get. And he's got probably the longest pull of anybody we've seen. Even with the hang, that bar is just right around his junk. And you can see where his belt is. The crease of his hip is about 4 inches, maybe 6 inches above where the bar is. And then you get all this real estate between the belt and his rib cage. And that tells you how long that torso is relative to his height. This is a byproduct of strength and aggression and not really seeing anything as a limitation. And that's where the psychological component is just as important as anything else. And then we get to me. I identify. I think I'm built similarly. I actually pull the bar pretty close. If I'm standing with perfect posture, the bar actually goes above my junk. But I've gotten really good at exploiting that round, that Konstantinov-like round in my upper back, and I let my shoulders hang like crazy. And I've gotten real good at scooping my hips in. And that advantage gives me a few inches at lockout. So the bar hangs just a little bit below the family jewels, sometimes grazing it. This is a 650 for 3, And this is actually the setup I was talking about earlier, where I start with straps, butt backing down, a bit more upright, shins vertical. That was the cue that really set all this in, because with the shins vertical, I could find exactly where my hips were at their strongest, and then I would brace around that. So it was the best balance of hips being in a strong starting position to push, midsection, upper back being in a strong position to support my spine, which is my biggest hurdle. And this is where I felt the most comfortable. Look, the stroke is even. That's really the important thing to know. This is another 655 for 5 here. The stroke is efficient. Butt back, butt forward. Butt back, butt forward. And I never get into disadvantage of position. The trick is being able to stay slightly upright for me, not getting too pitched over without this upright position being awkward, because if your weight comes back and down, you can kind of fall back, you can get off balance. It's hard to find exactly where that sweet spot is where you're loaded into the hips, but getting that down is what led to the biggest surge in my pull, and that's what I need to rediscover at this point, because I got a bit away from that with mixed results. So this is my deadlift breakdown. I hope this gave some insight. There's still a lot more I can discuss when it comes to training. I'm sure I could pick apart how all of these lifters trained if I go deep into the annals of the history of, if I go deep into the annals of the internet and try to find articles and training splits or whatever. Some of these guys, their training is pretty well documented. Cohen did pretty much a linear periodization scheme. I believe squatting and deadlifting once a week. The Lilly Bridges alternated, and that plays into somebody who's not advantaged for a deadlift. I took a note from that. He would squat heavy one week, deadlift heavy the next week, and then alternate with speed work in between. So it's pretty much heavy speed. So you were only doing 2 heavy sessions a month. And if you're struggling with recovery for something like a deadlift, that's a fantastic way to approach it. Harder workouts, but more spaced apart. And that's actually what I had to do. I know Kaler for a while was doing something like a conjugate split. I'd be interested to dig into that, or even talk to him and see what modifications he had to make, if he felt like he needed more work in some areas or got away with less work, or how he structured his conjugate work to prioritize one lift over the other, because it gets a little tricky, because if you only have one max effort lower body workout, it's difficult to juggle squatting and deadlifting. And a big tenet of that is treating them like similar lifts because they use the same musculature. But anyways, that's an entirely different video, and eventually I might get into that. Thank you for watching, guys. Go ahead and leave questions and comments in the comment box, and I'll get back to them. Go ahead and check out the forum, the Base Strength Forum on Facebook. Go ahead and check out Peak Strength and Base Strength on Amazon and on my store, EmpireBarbellStore.com. That's in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.